The photographer's assistant found the glass negative in April of 1952, tucked between water-damaged files in the basement of Woodbury County Historical Society. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable among the hundreds of school portraits catalogued from the late 19th century, 31 children arranged in 3 neat rows before a wooden schoolhouse, their expressions uniformly solemn as the long exposure demanded stillness. The handwritten label simply read, Millfield School, 1887. It might have been consigned to permanent obscurity, filed alongside countless similar images of frontier education, had the assistant not noticed something peculiar while preparing to archive it. In the upper corner of the photograph stood a slate blackboard, partially visible behind the tallest students. Written upon it in a careful, deliberate hand were 5 words that would eventually unravel the fate of an entire community. The children know what happened. Thomas Everett, the Society's chief archivist, initially dismissed his assistant's concern. Rural schoolhouses often displayed scripture or moral lessons. Perhaps this was simply a fragment of a longer educational passage. But when cross-referenced with county records, something troubling emerged. Millfield School had burned to the ground on December 18, 1887, just weeks after this photograph was taken. All 31 children in the portrait had perished in the fire, along with their teacher, Elizabeth Harmon. The official verdict had been tragic accident, a coal stove left unattended. Yet the photograph raised uncomfortable questions that had never been properly addressed. Why had the fire started during school hours, when the stove was always carefully monitored? Why were the doors reportedly blocked when rescuers arrived? And most disturbing of all, why had the county's investigation been closed with such remarkable speed, the record sealed by court order until 1950? Everett's inquiry into these questions would consume the next 5 years of his life, leading him through courthouse archives, family diaries, and the testimonies of aging townsfolk who still remembered the whispers that followed the tragedy. What emerged was a story not of sudden calamity, but of calculated silence, a conspiracy that had protected Millfield's most influential citizens while burying their crimes alongside their youngest victims. The roots of the tragedy reached back to 1886, when a succession of failed wheat harvests had pushed Millfield to the brink of economic collapse. The town's salvation came through James Warner Blackwood, a railroad investor from Boston who promised to route the new Chicago Western Line through Millfield, transforming the struggling settlement into a vital trading hub. In exchange, he required only land grants for the station and warehouses, plus a modest investment from the town's leading families. By spring of 1887, 20 prominent citizens had mortgaged their futures on Blackwood's promise, forming the Millfield Development Company. Construction began on the station, businesses expanded in anticipation of the coming boom, and Blackwood became the town's most celebrated visitor, staying in the finest rooms whenever he arrived to check on his investment. Yet by late summer, troubling rumors began circulating. A land surveyor passing through mentioned that the actual railroad route would pass 18 miles south of Millfield. A telegram was discovered suggesting Blackwood had similar, exclusive arrangements with 3 other towns along the proposed line. When questioned, Blackwood assured his investors these were merely competing bids. Millfield remained the prime candidate if they maintained their commitments. The town's school teacher, Elizabeth Harmon, became the first to voice public suspicion. The 30-year-old daughter of a railroad engineer from Chicago, Harmon had taken the teaching position after her father's death, bringing with her an understanding of railway planning that few in Millfield possessed. When she examined the proposed route, she immediately recognized its geographical impossibility. The elevation changes would require tunneling through solid granite, at a cost no company would bear when flatter terrain existed to the south. On October 12, 1887, Harmon wrote to the Chicago Western Railroad Company directly, inquiring about their plans for Millfield. Their response, preserved in her personal correspondence, was unequivocal. They had no authorized representative named Blackwood, no planned station for Millfield, and had already broken ground along the southern route. When Harmon presented this evidence at a town meeting, Blackwood and the investors publicly dismissed her as a hysterical woman meddling in men's business. Privately, however, panic spread among the 20 investors, who now faced financial ruin if Blackwood's fraud became widely known. Their mortgaged properties, extended credit lines, and reputation in the county would collapse simultaneously. By November, Blackwood had vanished with nearly $18,000 of the town's money, a devastating sum for a community of fewer than 500 people. The investors faced not only their own ruin, but the potential collapse of Millfield itself, as they had entangled the town's municipal funds in their scheme. Their desperation crystallized around a single imperative. The truth could never spread beyond their circle. But they had not accounted for Elizabeth Harmon's classroom of unusually observant children. In the weeks following Blackwood's disappearance, the children of the town's most prominent citizens began asking innocent questions at home. They had heard their teacher discussing the railroad man with Mr. Finch, the postmaster. They had seen letters from Chicago with official stamps. They wanted to know why Mayor Campbell's hands were shaking during his visit to the classroom. And most damning of all, they had witnessed a late-night meeting at the schoolhouse itself, when Elizabeth Harmon had shown town council members documents proving Blackwood's fraud and their complicity in covering it up once they'd realized the truth. The children knew. The town's leadership, now cornered by both financial disaster and the prospect of criminal charges, made a decision that would haunt Millfield for generations. Elizabeth Harmon had to be silenced, along with the witnesses she had inadvertently created. On November 25, 1887, the school portrait was taken. Harmon arranged her students in their finest clothes, positioned before the schoolhouse that had become the center of Millfield's growing crisis. While the photographer prepared his equipment, she wrote 5 words on the blackboard, visible only at the edge of the frame. The children know what happened. It was her insurance policy and her warning, a message she believed would protect them all. 3 weeks later, the schoolhouse burned. The official record claimed no survivors, though later investigations would reveal evidence suggesting at least 3 children had attempted to escape through windows that had been mysteriously nailed shut from the outside. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because every moment spent with these forgotten American stories helps preserve our true history, the darkness we try to erase and the voices that refuse to be silenced. Charlotte Finch had been the first to notice something wrong with the schoolhouse that morning. At 9 years old, she was considered unusually perceptive, a quality her father, the postmaster, often claimed came from her mother's side of the family. The Millfield winter had arrived early that December, with frost patterns etching the windows and breath clouding before faces as children made their way along dirt roads now hardened with ice. But it wasn't the cold that troubled Charlotte as she approached the white clapboard building. It was the unfamiliar padlock on the schoolhouse door. "Miss Harmon always unlocks it before we arrive," she told her younger brother William, who merely shrugged and joined the other children gathering on the front steps. In the months that followed, this detail would be absent from official accounts. No mention would be made of how Elizabeth Harmon, for the first time in her 3 years teaching at Millfield, had not been standing at the door greeting each child by name. No record would note how eventually Mayor Campbell's son, Thomas, produced a key his father had given him that morning, with instructions to make sure everyone gets inside promptly. By 8:45 a.m., all 31 students were assembled inside, their coats hung on hooks, their slates arranged on wooden desks scarred with the initials of children long grown. Elizabeth Harmon had still not arrived. "Father says Miss Harmon isn't feeling well," Thomas Campbell announced with an authority unusual for a 12-year-old. "Mr. Finch will be coming instead." This statement struck Charlotte as odd. Her father had said nothing about substituting at the school when they'd eaten breakfast together that morning. When she raised her hand to point this out, Thomas ignored her. "We're to copy these arithmetic problems until Mr. Finch arrives," he continued, gesturing to equations already written on the blackboard, directly below Miss Harmon's still visible message about what the children knew. Documents recovered from Millfield Town Council records would later reveal that Martin Finch had indeed been assigned to the school that morning, not as a teacher, but as a fire marshal performing a routine safety inspection. The inspection had been formally requested in writing the previous afternoon by Judge Emmett Wallace, whose 2 sons sat near the window in Elizabeth Harmon's classroom. At precisely 9:18 a.m., according to the broken pocket watch later recovered from the ashes, Martin Finch arrived at Millfield School. Several of the older students would recall that he seemed agitated, his normally friendly demeanor replaced with a grim efficiency. He did not take over the teaching as Thomas had announced. Instead, he moved purposefully through the building, checking windows and closets. "Is something wrong, Papa?" Charlotte asked when he passed her desk without acknowledging her. "Nothing's wrong," he replied without meeting her eyes. "Just making sure the stove is safe for winter." The coal stove stood at the rear of the classroom, already radiating heat. Martin spent several minutes examining it, then instructed Thomas Campbell and the Wallace boys to bring in more coal from the storage shed behind the building. "Stack it high," he told them. "It's going to be a cold day." At 9:27 a.m., Martin Finch left the schoolhouse. Multiple witnesses from nearby farms would later testify to seeing him walk briskly toward town without looking back. What none would mention, until Thomas Everett's investigation decades later, was that several other men had been observed in the woods behind the school shortly before flames became visible through the windows. Inside the classroom, the children continued working on their arithmetic problems as the stove grew increasingly hot. 10-year-old Joseph Parker, seated nearest to it, eventually raised his hand. "The stove's making strange noises, sir," he called to Thomas, who had assumed a position of authority at the teacher's desk. "Just keep working," Thomas replied tersely. Minutes later, smoke began seeping from around the stovepipe where it entered the ceiling. This time, several children rose from their seats in alarm. "Sit down!" Thomas shouted with unexpected ferocity. "Father said no one leaves until Mr. Finch returns." It was at this moment that Charlotte Finch noticed something even more troubling than the smoke. Through the window, she could see her father standing with Mayor Campbell and Judge Wallace at the edge of the school property. They were not moving toward the building, despite the now visible smoke. They were simply watching. "The door's stuck," cried Mary Wallace, who had ignored Thomas's command and run to the entrance. She pulled frantically at the handle. "It won't open!" Panic spread through the classroom as smoke thickened. The older children rushed to the windows, only to find them unusually difficult to raise, as if something had been done to the sash weights. By the time they managed to break the glass, flames had engulfed the rear wall, and thick black smoke made it impossible to see across the room. Historical accounts would later describe heroic efforts by townspeople to save the children. What they omitted was how those efforts began suspiciously late, with the alarm being raised only after flames had fully engulfed the structure. They failed to mention how Judge Wallace physically restrained the blacksmith who tried to approach the burning building, claiming it was too dangerous. No record acknowledged that when Charlotte Finch finally appeared at a broken window, screaming for her father's help, Martin Finch turned away. The official death toll was 32, 31 children, and Elizabeth Harmon, whose body was reportedly found at her desk, though several witnesses would later question whether she had ever been in the building at all that morning. The school portrait, taken just weeks before, became Millfield's memorial to the tragedy, reproduced in the county newspaper and displayed prominently in the town hall. Few noticed the message barely visible on the blackboard behind the smiling faces. Fewer still connected it to the sealed investigation that followed. In the days after the fire, Millfield's prominent families closed ranks. The town council, comprised entirely of men who had invested in Blackwood's railroad scheme, convened an emergency session closed to the public. The county sheriff, brother-in-law to Mayor Campbell, conducted a brief investigation concluding that a faulty stove had caused the tragic accident. What no official would address was the rumor that began circulating among the house servants and farm workers. Elizabeth Harmon had been seen alive after the fire, fleeing west on the morning coach with a leather satchel full of papers. Some claimed she had collected evidence of corruption far beyond Blackwood's initial fraud, evidence that implicated Millfield's leaders in crimes that would have sent them to prison if exposed. By Christmas of 1887, a code of silence had descended over Millfield. Parents who had lost children were quietly compensated with debt forgiveness, prime farmland, or cash payments described in town records as bereavement support. Those who asked too many questions found themselves ostracized, their businesses boycotted, their church pews empty on Sundays. The 20 investors, their terrible secret sealed by shared guilt, grew more prosperous in the years that followed. Without Blackwood's railroad scheme draining their resources, they consolidated control over the county's agriculture and commerce. The Wallace family opened a bank. The Campbells expanded into lumber mills and cattle. The Finches established a lucrative shipping business. And in the town cemetery, a large marble angel stood watch over 31 graves arranged in 3 neat rows, exactly as the children had posed for their final portrait. The monument bore a simple inscription: "Taken by God's will, December 18, 1887. No mention was made of Elizabeth Harmon, whose body, some whispered, had never actually been recovered from the ashes. The photograph that captured their last image remained displayed for decades, though positioned just carefully enough that the Blackboard's message remained in shadow, its warning about what the children knew relegated to the darkness that Millfield preferred for its most troubling truths. Spring arrived unusually early in 1888, as if nature itself sought to cleanse Millfield of its winter horrors. By March, snowdrops pushed through soil still blackened by ash around the school's foundation. The town council had already approved funds to rebuild on a different site, farther from the main street where the daily sight of ruins had begun affecting business at nearby establishments. Benjamin Harmon arrived in Millfield on the morning stage from Chicago on March 17th, stepping down onto the muddy street with a leather suitcase and the weary expression of a man who had traveled too far with too little rest. At 43, he carried himself with the rigid posture of his former military service, though his left sleeve hung empty below the elbow, a permanent reminder of Shiloh. Few in town recognized the tall, bearded stranger, but Martin Finch, collecting mail at the depot, felt a cold dread the moment he saw him. "You're Elizabeth's brother," Finch said, not a question but an acknowledgement. The family resemblance was unmistakable, the same determined set of the jaw, the same penetrating gray eyes. "I am," Benjamin replied evenly. "I've come for her belongings, and for answers." News of the visitor spread through Millfield with remarkable speed. By noon, Mayor Campbell had invited Benjamin to dine at his home, an offer presented as neighborly courtesy but understood by both men as surveillance. Judge Wallace suddenly discovered urgent business requiring his presence in the county seat. And in the Grand Victorian at the edge of town, the widow Agnes Blackwood, who had arrived just weeks after the fire, claiming to be the railroad investor's grieving wife, instructed her maid to listen carefully to all conversations at the hotel where Benjamin had taken a room. What none of them knew was that Benjamin Harmon had not come to Millfield unprepared. A former Pinkerton detective before the war had cost him his arm. He had spent the 3 months since his sister's reported death conducting his own investigation. The delayed telegram informing him of Elizabeth's death had immediately struck him as suspicious, as had the town council's prompt payment covering funeral expenses for a body they claimed had been too badly burned for transport home. In Chicago, Benjamin had visited the Western Railroad Company's headquarters, confirming what his sister had already discovered. No James Warner Blackwood had ever been authorized to negotiate station locations. More troublingly, he learned that Elizabeth had sent a thick packet of documents to the company's legal department just days before the fire, documents that had triggered an internal investigation immediately halted when news arrived of the school tragedy. "Your sister seemed to believe she and her students were in danger," the railroad solicitor had told him privately. "She included a letter requesting our intervention should anything happen to her. Unfortunately, it arrived too late." That packet had contained evidence Benjamin now carried duplicates of in a false bottom of his suitcase. Forged land deeds, fraudulent stock certificates, and municipal bonds issued without proper authority, all bearing signatures of Millfield's most respected citizens. More damning still were the personal letters Elizabeth had collected, revealing how Millfield's leadership had discovered Blackwood's fraud weeks before his disappearance, but had chosen to continue the scheme themselves, hoping to recoup their losses by selling worthless shares to neighboring communities. What Benjamin sought now was not just confirmation of what he already suspected, but evidence of exactly how far these men had gone to protect their conspiracy. Had his sister truly died in that fire? Or had something else happened? Something connected to the strange rumors that had reached him about Elizabeth being seen afterward. And most importantly, had 31 children been sacrificed merely to protect powerful men from financial ruin and public disgrace? During his first day in Millfield, Benjamin established the careful persona of a grieving brother seeking only personal effects and closure. He visited the cemetery, hat in hand, standing solemnly before the marble angel. He met with Reverend Collins, who had conducted the memorial service. He inquired politely about his sister's boarding house room and her possessions. What he did not reveal was how much he observed in the townspeople's reactions, the nervous glances, the rehearsed responses, the conspicuous absence of any teacher's belongings to return to him. Everything had apparently been destroyed in the fire, even items that would have been at her lodging rather than the school. On his second day, Benjamin visited the ruins of the schoolhouse. The site had been partially cleared, though charred timbers still protruded from melted snow like accusing fingers. As he stood contemplating the blackened foundation, he noticed a small figure watching him from behind a nearby oak tree. A girl of perhaps 11 or 12, thin and hollow-eyed. "You're Miss Harmon's brother," she said when she realized he'd spotted her. It wasn't a question. "I am," he replied, approaching slowly as one might with a nervous animal. "Did you know my sister?" The girl nodded solemnly. "I was supposed to be there that day," she whispered. "But I was sick. Mama kept me home." Benjamin knelt to meet her eyes, despite the mud soaking into his trouser knee. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Miller. My pa works at the mill." She glanced around nervously before continuing. "Miss Harmon was nice. She taught me extra after school sometimes because I want to be a teacher too." "Did Miss Harmon seem worried about anything before the fire?" Sarah's face clouded. "She told us to remember everything we saw and heard. Said someday it might be important." The girl hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "She gave me this the day before. Said if anything happened to her, I should hide it somewhere safe." The paper, when Benjamin carefully unfolded it, contained a list of names and figures, amounts invested in the railroad scheme, along with dates of meetings and references to documents. At the bottom, in Elizabeth's neat handwriting, evidence held by E.H., copies with B.H., Chicago, and Western Railroad legal debt. "Did you show this to anyone else?" Benjamin asked quietly. Sarah shook her head vehemently. "Miss Harmon made me promise. She said men like Mayor Campbell would hurt anyone who knew what they did." "What else did she tell you?" "That she was afraid. That Mr. Blackwood wasn't really gone. That he was still in Millfield sometimes, meeting with the men at night." Sarah's voice dropped even lower. "And she said if a woman came claiming to be Mrs. Blackwood, it wasn't true. There was no Mrs. Blackwood." This confirmation of Benjamin's suspicions about the mysterious widow sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the March wind. If Agnes Blackwood was an imposter, it suggested a level of ongoing deception far beyond covering up past fraud. The conspiracy hadn't ended with the fire, it had evolved. As Benjamin walked Sarah home, extracting a promise that she would tell no one about their conversation, he noticed a curtain moving in the mayor's front window. Campbell was watching them, his face partially visible in the gap, and the expression it bore was not curiosity, but fear. That evening, Benjamin wrote a careful letter to his former supervisor at the Pinkerton Agency, encoding the most sensitive information in a cipher they had used during the war. He sealed it and personally handed it to the eastbound stage driver with a generous tip to ensure its delivery. As he turned away from the depot, he found himself face to face with Judge Wallace, whose sudden return from neighboring Coopersville seemed suspiciously timed. "Mr. Harmon," the judge said, his tone cordial, though his eyes remained cold. "I understand you've been asking questions around town, reopening painful memories for folks who've suffered greatly." "I'm simply trying to understand what happened to my sister," Benjamin replied evenly. Wallace's thin smile never reached his eyes. "A terrible accident, as I'm sure you've been told. We all admired Miss Harmon's dedication to her pupils. Their loss, all their losses, was devastating to our community." "Indeed, though I find it curious how quickly Millfield has recovered. Your new bank building is quite impressive for a town that nearly faced economic collapse last autumn." Something dangerous flickered across Wallace's features before his judicial mask returned. "Progress continues, Mr. Harmon, even through grief. Perhaps especially through grief. How long do you plan to stay with us?" "Only until I'm satisfied." "About your sister's death." "About everything that happened in Millfield." The implied threat in Wallace's next words was unmistakable despite his pleasant tone. "Our town can be quite unwelcoming to those who overstay. The hotel has had issues with vermin recently. Fires, too. Safety concerns. Benjamin met his gaze steadily. I've faced worse dangers than inhospitable accommodations, Judge Wallace. No doubt, but consider this. Your sister is gone. Nothing will bring her back. Whatever questions you have, perhaps they're best left buried with her. If she is indeed buried here, Benjamin replied softly. The color drained from Wallace's face. Before he could respond, Benjamin tipped his hat and continued down the boardwalk, feeling the judge's eyes burning into his back with each step. That night, someone searched Benjamin's hotel room while he dined downstairs. The intruder was skilled enough to leave minimal evidence, but Benjamin had placed nearly invisible threads across his suitcase locks, threads now broken. The false bottom containing Elizabeth's documents remained undiscovered, but the violation confirmed what he already knew. Millfield's secrets were still dangerous enough to protect at any cost. If you're still watching this, pause for a moment and leave a comment telling me. If the truth had been revealed earlier, could those children have been saved? Your perspective helps illuminate these forgotten chapters of our hidden. The days that followed transformed Benjamin Harmon's investigation from a private inquiry into a silent war. Though no direct confrontation occurred, the battle lines had clearly been drawn. Each morning, Benjamin would leave his hotel room to find someone, Martin Finch, one of the Wallace sons, or another member of Millfield's founding families, casually positioned to observe his movements. Each evening, he would return to find subtle evidence that his belongings had been examined. What his watchers didn't realize was how much Benjamin learned from their surveillance. The very pattern of who monitored him on which day revealed the hierarchy of Millfield's conspiracy. Judge Wallace clearly commanded the greatest authority, with Mayor Campbell as his lieutenant. The others, Finch, Dr. Reynolds, Banker Holloway, formed a protective circle around these two, their nervous deference revealing who truly controlled the town's terrible secret. April brought relentless rain to Millfield, turning the streets to mud and the cemetery into a field of sinking monuments. Benjamin used the weather as cover, visiting farms on the town's outskirts where he spoke with laborers and servants whose tongues loosened when they learned his identity. From these conversations emerged fragments of truth. How Elizabeth had begun collecting evidence after discovering ledgers in the schoolhouse attic where town council meetings were sometimes held. How the children had overheard discussions not meant for their ears. How in the week before the fire, Elizabeth had kept the students late, teaching them to memorize details that might someday matter. Most disturbing were the whispered accounts of the fire itself, how quickly it had spread, as if fed by something more volatile than coal, how the screams had been audible all the way to the town square, how certain men had prevented would-be rescuers from approaching until it was far too late. The blacksmith, old Ferguson, he tried to break down the door, Mrs. Simmons told Benjamin as she handed him tea in her kitchen, her husband away working their small farm. Judge Wallace had him arrested afterward, claimed he was interfering with emergency procedures, released him the next day, but Ferguson was different after, stopped talking about what he saw, month later sold his smithy for half its value and moved west. Benjamin recorded everything in a journal written in the same military cipher he had used during the war. Each night, he added to a diagram showing the connections between Millfield's prominent citizens and their roles in both Blackwood's fraud and its subsequent concealment. At the center of this web, a question remained. Who was the woman calling herself Agnes Blackwood, and what was her true purpose in Millfield? The answer came from an unexpected source. On a particularly stormy afternoon, as Benjamin sat alone in the hotel dining room, the mysterious widow herself entered, elegantly dressed in black silk that rustled with her determined stride across the wooden floor. Without invitation, she took the chair opposite him, fixing him with eyes too calculating to match her morning attire. "Mr. Harmon," she said, her voice cultured but with an accent that subtly contradicted her claimed Boston origins. "I believe it's time we spoke directly." Benjamin studied her with professional detachment. Mid-30s, attractive in a severe way, with a composure that suggested experience in difficult situations. "Mrs. Blackwood," he acknowledged, "though I suspect that's not actually your name." A flicker of appreciation crossed her features. "Perceptive. I was told you were a formidable investigator before your injury. Her eyes flicked briefly to his empty sleeve. My real name is irrelevant. What matters is that we find ourselves in similar positions, outsiders in a town with poisonous secrets. With one significant difference, Benjamin noted dryly. You're part of those secrets. She inclined her head slightly, conceding the point. By necessity, not choice. When your employment options are limited by your gender, you make compromises. Including impersonating the wife of a confidence man? James and I had an arrangement. I provided respectability. He provided opportunity. She poured herself tea from his pot without asking. When things collapsed here, he left me to clean up his mess, retrieve what funds remained, ensure no trail led back to our previous endeavors. Yet you stayed, even after the fire. Benjamin watched her face carefully. Why? Because something changed. The men who had been James's victims suddenly had capital again. Property was exchanging hands without public sales. Judge Wallace began building a bank with money he shouldn't have possessed. Her voice hardened. And 31 children were dead, Mr. Harmon. Even in my profession, that demands explanation. You think they killed those children to silence them. I know they did, just as I know your sister wasn't in that schoolhouse. She held up a hand as Benjamin straightened in his chair. Don't misunderstand. I believe Elizabeth Harmon is dead, but she didn't die in that fire. For a moment, neither spoke as the implication settled between them. Benjamin had suspected this, but hearing it confirmed made his throat tighten with a terrible mixture of hope and dread. Tell me, he said finally. I saw her the night before the fire. Not directly. I observed her through a window at Judge Wallace's home. She was in distress. Wallace and Campbell were present, along with Finch. They had papers spread on the table, papers she kept trying to gather. Agnes, or whatever her real name was, looked down at her teacup. The next morning, the school burned. That evening, I watched them take a wrapped bundle from Wallace's cellar out to the wagons heading for the schoolhouse ruins. They killed her first, Benjamin said quietly. Then staged the fire to cover both her murder and their financial crimes. And to silence the children who had seen too much. Agnes met his eyes directly. I'm a fraudster, Mr. Harmon, not a monster. I want no part in the murder of children. That's why I've stayed, collecting evidence, waiting for an opportunity. Benjamin assessed her carefully, weighing the risk of trusting a self-confessed confidence woman against the advantage her information might provide. What do you propose? An alliance. I have access to homes and conversations you don't. You have legitimate authority and connections beyond Millfield that I lack. She leaned forward. Together, we could expose what happened here. Not just the fraud or the fire, but all of it. How deeply the corruption runs. How many people protected murderers to preserve their standing. Why would you take such a risk? These men wouldn't hesitate to silence you as they did my sister. Agnes smiled thinly. Because unlike Elizabeth, I anticipated betrayal from the beginning. I have my own insurance policies in place, documents detailing everything, held by associates who will release them if anything happens to me. As Benjamin considered her offer, rain lashed against the window with renewed intensity, turning the street outside into flowing mud. Through the glass, he could see Martin Finch watching the hotel from the shelter of a shop awning across the street. They're already suspicious of us meeting, Benjamin observed. Let them be. Fear makes men careless. Agnes rose smoothly, adjusting her mourning veil. You have until tomorrow to decide, Mr. Harmon. After that, I'll pursue justice through my own methods, which may be less discriminating than yours. After she departed, Benjamin remained at the table, turning his teacup slowly between fingers and thumb. The pain of Elizabeth's murder, no longer just suspected but confirmed, burned cold in his chest. Yet the investigator in him recognized the strategic advantage Agnes offered, despite the obvious risks of trusting her. That evening, he made his decision. Using the hotel's stationery, he penned a brief note with a time and location for their next meeting, then walked through the diminishing rain to deliver it personally to the Blackwood residence. As he approached the elegant home at the edge of town, Benjamin noticed something unusual. No lamps were lit within despite the early evening hour. The front gate stood partially open. An instinct developed through years of detective work made him approach with caution, his hand moving to the revolver concealed beneath his coat. The front door of the Blackwood house was unlocked. Inside, furniture had been overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor. The systematic destruction spoke not of robbery, but of a desperate search. Moving silently through the darkened rooms, Benjamin found further evidence of violence: a broken vase, scuff marks on the wooden floor, and finally, a dark stain on the Turkish carpet that his experienced eye recognized immediately as blood. Agnes Blackwood was gone. Taken or fled, he couldn't determine. But one thing was certain: Millfield's conspirators had escalated from surveillance to action. The careful balance of threat and observation had collapsed into something more dangerous. As Benjamin slipped out the back door, he spotted a folded paper tucked beneath a vase on the writing desk, positioned in a way that suggested it had been deliberately placed for someone to find. Opening it with a handkerchief to preserve any evidence, he found a roughly drawn map with an X marked beside the river, 3 miles outside of town. Beneath it, a single line in what he recognized as Agnes's handwriting: "Where they buried what wouldn't burn." Benjamin knew then that his investigation had entered its final phase. Whatever evidence lay buried by the river would either break Millfield's conspiracy or seal his fate alongside his sister's. Either way, the time for careful observation had ended. The next step would require action, and likely violence. As he made his way back to the hotel through the muddy darkness, Benjamin felt the weight of 32 deaths pressing upon his conscience. His sister, her students, all sacrificed to protect men who valued their reputations above innocent lives. If justice existed in this world, he would ensure they answered for every drop of spilled blood, no matter the personal cost. Dawn broke through scattered clouds as Benjamin Harmon made his way along the river path, his boots sinking into mud still soft from the previous day's rain. He had left the hotel before first light, taking a circuitous route to avoid the watchful eyes that had become increasingly evident around town. The map Agnes had left him indicated a location in a stand of cottonwoods where the river bent sharply eastward, creating a sheltered hollow rarely visited even by local fishermen. He carried a small shovel borrowed from the hotel's coal room, his revolver, and a growing certainty that he was approaching not just evidence, but a grave. The question that haunted his steps was whose remains he might find: Agnes, Elizabeth, or perhaps others whose disappearance had been conveniently explained during Millfield's dark season of secrets. The cottonwoods came into view as the sun cleared the horizon, their new spring leaves shimmering silver green in the morning light. Benjamin paused at the edge of the small grove, surveying the ground for signs of recent disturbance. Nothing was immediately visible, but decades of investigation had taught him that the earth revealed its secrets to patient observation. Methodically, he began examining the area, moving in an expanding spiral from the center of the grove. On his third circuit, he found what he was looking for: a section where the previous autumn's fallen leaves lay in a pattern slightly different from their surroundings, their distribution suggesting they had been scattered deliberately rather than fallen naturally. Clearing the leaves revealed soil that, while settled, showed subtle signs of having been previously disturbed. Benjamin began to dig, the physical labor awkward with just one arm but manageable through determination. 3 feet down, the shovel struck something solid. Kneeling, he brushed away dirt to reveal not bones as he had feared, but a metal box, a document case of the type used for legal papers, its surface corroded but intact. When he pried it open, Benjamin found exactly what Agnes had promised: evidence. Inside were financial ledgers showing the diversion of Millfield municipal funds into the railroad scheme, correspondence between Judge Wallace, Mayor Campbell, and other conspirators after they discovered Blackwood's fraud, and most damning of all, a detailed plan for dealing with the Harmon situation should she take her evidence public. The documents confirmed everything Benjamin had pieced together. Blackwood had indeed been a confidence man who had defrauded Millfield's leading citizens. But rather than admit their humiliation and financial loss, these men had chosen to continue the scheme themselves, drawing in additional investors from neighboring communities to recoup their money. When Elizabeth discovered their expanded fraud and gathered evidence, they had silenced her permanently and then eliminated the children who had witnessed too much. As Benjamin carefully returned the documents to the case, a twig snapped behind him. He turned sharply, reaching for his revolver, but found himself facing not an attacker, but Sarah Miller, the young girl who had been absent the day of the fire. "I followed you," she said simply, her thin face solemn in the dappled morning light. "I saw you leaving town." Benjamin lowered his weapon. "You shouldn't be here, Sarah. It isn't safe." "Nowhere is safe," she replied, with the terrible wisdom of a child who had lost everything. "Not since they burned the school." "How did you know where I was going?" "I didn't, but Miss Harmon told us once that the river keeps secrets better than people do." She looked at the metal box in Benjamin's hand. "Did you find her?" The question pierced him with its hope and innocence. "Not her, Sarah. Just papers. But papers that tell the truth about what happened." The girl nodded, as if this confirmed something she already knew. "They killed her before the fire, in Judge Wallace's cellar." She spoke matter-of-factly, without tears. "I heard Mrs. Wallace's maid telling my mother. She said there was blood they couldn't wash out of the stones." Benjamin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You've known all this time?" "Everyone knows, they just don't say it." Sarah kicked at a stone near her foot. "The grown-ups think if they don't talk about it, it didn't happen. But we remember. The children who weren't there that day, we remember for the ones who were." As Benjamin absorbed the implications of her words, that Millfield's conspiracy was simultaneously an open secret and a collective denial, he became aware of another sound. Horses approaching along the river path. Sarah heard it too, her eyes widening with alarm. "Hide!" Benjamin instructed, guiding her toward a dense thicket of brush. "No matter what happens, stay hidden until they're gone." He had barely concealed the metal case beneath his coat when 3 riders appeared at the edge of the cottonwood grove: Judge Wallace, Mayor Campbell, and Martin Finch. All 3 carried shotguns. "Mr. Harmon," Wallace called, his judicial demeanor firmly in place despite the weapon across his saddle. "You're out early for a man still recovering from war injuries." "The morning air is restorative," Benjamin replied evenly, positioning himself to keep their attention away from Sarah's hiding place. "Though I admit the river wasn't my intended destination. I seem to have gotten turned around in unfamiliar territory." Campbell snorted in obvious disbelief. "Just happened to wander 3 miles from town with a shovel, did you?" "The hotel manager mentioned good fishing spots along this stretch. I thought I might dig for bait." Benjamin maintained a calm he did not feel, acutely aware of both the document case hidden beneath his coat and the child concealed within earshot. "But I see this area is already occupied by Millfield's most distinguished citizens, also out early and heavily armed." "Spring turkey season," Finch offered, his expression betraying discomfort with the confrontation. Unlike his companions, Martin Finch had always struck Benjamin as a man dragged into conspiracy rather than a willing architect of it, a distinction that might prove useful. "Indeed, those shotguns seem excessive for morning paperwork, Judge Wallace. Or were those legal documents in your saddlebag meant for some rural client?" Wallace's composed facade cracked slightly. "You've been busy, Mr. Harmon. Too busy, I'm afraid. Millfield is a close community. We protect our own. By murdering school children?" The words escaped before Benjamin could moderate them, his professional detachment finally overcome by the horror of what these men had done. A heavy silence fell. Campbell's face flushed dark red, but Wallace maintained his cold composure. "Tragic accidents happen even in the most careful communities," the judge said. "As for your sister, she chose to interfere in matters beyond her understanding, with disastrous consequences." "You murdered her," Benjamin stated flatly, "in your cellar. Then you burned 31 children alive to cover your financial crimes and her death." Finch paled visibly, his horse shifting beneath him as if sensing his distress. Campbell's hand tightened on his shotgun, but Wallace merely sighed, the sound of a man confronting an unpleasant but manageable problem. "Your sister was offered a choice," Wallace said. "Leave Millfield with enough money to start fresh elsewhere or face the consequences of her interference. She rejected our generosity." "So you killed her, and then those children." "The fire was regrettable but necessary," Campbell interjected, his tone suggesting the matter was simply one of practical administration. "The alternative was complete ruin for Millfield's most important families. One teacher and a classroom of children, most from insignificant families, against the future of our entire community." The casual dismissal of 32 lives staggered Benjamin, though he kept his expression neutral. "And Mrs. Blackwood? Was she another regrettable necessity?" A flicker of confusion crossed Wallace's face. "Agnes left town yesterday. A family emergency in Boston," she said. This confirmation that Agnes had managed to flee, or at least had created the impression of doing so, shifted Benjamin's calculation. If she had escaped with additional evidence, as she'd claimed to have arranged, there might still be hope for justice beyond what he carried beneath his coat. "Gentlemen," Benjamin said carefully, "I think we all recognize this situation has reached its conclusion. You've had your turkey hunt. I'll be taking the afternoon stage back to Chicago." Wallace studied him with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to determining others' weaknesses. "Empty-handed? I think not, Mr. Harmon. Whatever you found here belongs to Millfield." "I've found nothing but mud and disappointment." Benjamin spread his hands in a gesture of defeat, keeping the document case concealed. "My sister is dead. No evidence I've discovered would convince authorities to reopen an investigation against men of your standing." "Search him," Wallace ordered Campbell, who dismounted and approached with obvious anticipation. As the mayor patted him down, Benjamin allowed himself to be relieved of his revolver, but tensed when Campbell's hands moved toward the inside of his coat. The shot that rang out then came not from any of their weapons, but from the tree line behind them. Campbell staggered backward, clutching his shoulder as blood spread through his expensive coat. A second shot sent Wallace and Finch diving for cover, their horses rearing in panic. Benjamin seized the moment of confusion to drive his elbow into Campbell's wounded shoulder, sending the man to his knees with a howl of pain. Retrieving his revolver from where it had fallen, Benjamin fired a warning shot over Wallace's position behind a fallen log. "The next one won't miss, Judge," he called. "Order your men to drop their weapons." "This is madness, Harmon," Wallace shouted back. "You're outnumbered and surrounded by people loyal to me." "Am I?" Benjamin gestured toward the tree line, where a figure had emerged with a rifle. Not Agnes, as he had momentarily hoped, but Ferguson, the blacksmith who had tried to save the children during the fire. Behind him appeared 2 more men, whom Benjamin recognized as farmers who had lost children in the schoolhouse. "Word spreads," Ferguson called, his rifle still trained on Wallace's position. "We've been watching, waiting. Seems today's the day for truth to come out." More figures appeared from the surrounding woods, parents, siblings, neighbors of the victims. Many carried weapons, all wore expressions of grim determination. Benjamin realized then that Sarah had not followed him by chance. She had alerted others about where he was headed. Martin Finch was the first to surrender, placing his shotgun on the ground with visible relief. Mayor Campbell, still clutching his bleeding shoulder, soon followed. Only Judge Wallace remained defiant, his aristocratic features twisted with contempt for the common people now confronting him. "You can't touch me," he spat. "I am the law in this county." "Not anymore," Benjamin replied, retrieving the metal document case. "These papers tell the true story of what happened in Millfield, including your planning and execution of mass murder. It will be for a federal court to determine your fate." As the crowd closed in around them, Benjamin noticed Sarah emerging from her hiding place, walking directly to Ferguson's side. The blacksmith placed a protective hand on her shoulder, his eyes never leaving Wallace's face. "We heard them talking," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "All of us who weren't there that day. We heard them planning what to do about Miss Harmon. We've been waiting for someone to believe us." In that moment, Benjamin understood the full extent of Millfield's tragedy. Not just the murdered children and his sister, but the survivors trapped in a conspiracy of silence, waiting years for justice that seemed would never come. When federal marshals arrived in Millfield the following week, summoned by telegrams Benjamin had dispatched from the next county, they found a town transformed. The conspiracy had collapsed under its own weight, with minor participants rushing to testify against those they had once protected. Martin Finch provided state's evidence in exchange for leniency. Wallace and Campbell stood trial for multiple counts of murder and fraud, their carefully constructed respectability crumbling under the weight of documented evidence and eyewitness testimony. The mysterious Agnes Blackwood was never found, though rumors persisted of a well-dressed widow establishing a new life in San Francisco with surprising financial resources. Benjamin sometimes wondered if she had orchestrated more of events than he had realized, perhaps even arranging for Ferguson and the others to appear at the crucial moment by the river. As spring gave way to summer in 1888, Benjamin Harmon remained in Millfield long enough to see justice set in motion and to help establish a memorial fund for rebuilding the school, this time with his sister's name above the door. The new building would stand not as a monument to tragedy, but as a testament to the power of truth against even the most entrenched corruption. Before departing, he visited the school portrait one final time, now displayed in the town hall with the Blackboard message fully visible rather than hidden in shadow. "The children know what happened," Elizabeth had written, her final warning preserved for posterity in silver nitrate and glass. Indeed, they had known. And finally, so did everyone else. Autumn winds scattered golden leaves across Elizabeth Harmon's grave as Benjamin knelt to place fresh flowers beside the simple headstone. October 1888 had brought crisp mornings and early frosts to Millfield, along with the first real sense of healing since the previous winter's horrors. After the federal investigation had concluded and the primary conspirators sentenced to prison, Benjamin had overseen the proper reburial of his sister, whose remains had indeed been recovered from a shallow grave near Judge Wallace's property. The service, attended by nearly everyone in Millfield, represented more than personal closure. It symbolized the town's collective acknowledgement of truths too long denied. "I thought I might find you here," came a voice behind him. Sarah Miller stood at the edge of the cemetery path, taller now and less hollow-eyed than when they had first met. The month since the confrontation by the river had brought subtle but significant changes to the girl. She stood straighter, spoke more confidently, and had taken to carrying a notebook in which she recorded everything she considered important. "Just saying goodbye," Benjamin replied, rising stiffly. His extended stay in Millfield had never been intended as permanent, though various matters had repeatedly delayed his departure. "The Chicago train leaves at noon." Sarah nodded, her expression solemn but not sad. "Ferguson says to thank you again. The blacksmith shop is doing well now that he's back." "And your family? How is the mill working out?" "Pa says it's strange being part owner, but good." Sarah's father had been among many who had received compensation from the redistribution of assets seized from Wallace, Campbell, and their co-conspirators. The economic rebalancing had transformed Millfield from a town dominated by a few powerful families to a community with more broadly distributed prosperity. "He still doesn't like me wanting to be a teacher, though." Benjamin smiled. "He'll come around. Elizabeth would have been proud to see you following that path." They walked together through the cemetery, past the marble angel that still watched over the children's graves. The monument had been modified in recent months, each child's name now individually inscribed rather than subsumed under a single platitude about God's will. More significantly, a new plaque detailed the true circumstances of their deaths, ensuring future generations would remember not just that they had died, but why and at whose hands. "The new school opens next week," Sarah said as they reached the cemetery gate. "They're hanging the portrait in the main hall. Mrs. Jenkins insisted the Blackboard message be properly visible." Amelia Jenkins, who had replaced Wallace as county judge following a special election, had emerged as one of Millfield's most effective leaders during the recovery. Her insistence on full transparency about the town's dark chapter had initially met resistance but ultimately proved crucial to healing. "The truth can hurt," Benjamin mused, "but secrets poison a community from within. Your teacher understood that." As they continued toward town, Benjamin observed the physical changes that had accompanied Millfield's moral transformation. The imposing bank Wallace had built with stolen funds now served as a town library. The Blackwood mansion had been converted into a boarding school for children from outlying farms. Most significantly, the new schoolhouse stood on its original foundation, rebuilt not as an erasure of tragedy, but as a deliberate reclamation of space tainted by violence. Near the town square, they encountered Martin Finch, now reduced to working as a clerk in the general store after his testimony had spared him prison, but not public censure. His role in the conspiracy, particularly his abandonment of his own daughter during the fire, had marked him as permanently diminished in the community's eyes. "Mr. Harmon," Finch acknowledged with a nod, his once confident posture now perpetually stooped. "Leaving us at last." "My work here is finished," Benjamin replied neutrally. While he understood the judicial necessity of Finch's plea agreement, he had never managed personal forgiveness for the man's role in Elizabeth's death and the children's murder. "There's talk of a book," Finch said, his tone suggesting both concern and resignation. "About what happened here. Chicago publisher sent a man asking questions last month." "The truth belongs to history now," Benjamin answered, "though I'm not the one writing it." This was technically accurate, though incomplete. While Benjamin had declined several publishing offers, he had provided extensive documentation to a trusted journalist whose manuscript was nearing completion. Millfield's story would indeed reach national audience, serving as both warning about corruption's terrible cost and testament to the possibility of justice, however delayed. As they continued toward the station, Benjamin felt the familiar weight of his sister's journal in his coat pocket. Of all Elizabeth's recovered possessions, this personal record of her thoughts and observations during her final months had affected him most deeply. Her clear-eyed documentation of Millfield's corruption appeared alongside her hopes for her students, her increasingly worried reflections about their safety, and finally, her determination to protect them whatever the cost. The journal's final entry, dated the day before her murder, read simply, "If they silence me, the children's testimony remains. The truth cannot stay buried forever. Someone will come who cares enough to dig." That prediction had proven prophetic, though not in the way Elizabeth had hoped. The children she had tried to protect had been silenced alongside her, their potential testimony transformed into the very reason for their murder. Yet in death, they had ultimately spoken more powerfully than they might have in life. Their innocent faces in the school portrait standing as permanent accusation against those who had valued money and reputation above 31 young lives. At the station platform, Sarah handed Benjamin a small package wrapped in brown paper. "From all of us," she explained. "The children who weren't there that day. We wanted you to have it." Inside was a hand-bound collection of memories, stories, drawings, and recollections of Elizabeth Harmon and the classmates they had lost, each page carefully created by one of the surviving children. The simple inscription read, "We remember. We tell their stories now." Benjamin felt his composure falter for the first time in months. "This is... Thank you, Sarah, and please thank the others." "Miss Harmon always said that remembering is a kind of justice," Sarah replied. "That's why she taught us to memorize things. Names, dates, conversations we overheard. She said someday it might matter. She was right about that. And about you, your potential." Benjamin placed a hand briefly on the girl's shoulder. "Keep writing everything down, Sarah. Memory fades, but what's recorded endures." The train whistle sounded in the distance as Benjamin gathered his few belongings. His investigation had brought justice, but not restoration. The dead remained dead, their absence a permanent wound in Millfield's collective identity. Yet watching Sarah, who now taught informal writing lessons to younger children while continuing her own education, Benjamin found reason for cautious hope. From the soil of tragedy, new purpose had taken root. As the train pulled into the station, Benjamin took one last look at the town that had claimed his sister's life, yet honored her memory through its painful rebirth. The morning sun illuminated the new schoolhouse on the hill, its windows reflecting light where once there had been only ashes and grief. "Will you ever come back?" Sarah asked as he boarded. Perhaps someday, Benjamin replied, though both knew it was unlikely. His connection to Millfield would always be primarily through loss, the resolution he had helped achieve necessarily incomplete. From the train window, Benjamin watched as Sarah remained on the platform until the last moment, her small figure gradually receding as the locomotive gathered speed. In her hand, he could still make out the notebook where she recorded everything of importance, a habit learned from Elizabeth and maintained as both practical discipline and memorial act. The children had known what happened. Thanks to them, so did history. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with someone who appreciates true historical narratives.